Pursuant to notice for purposes of markup, I call up H-Res 147, calling for the release of United States citizen Saeed Abedini and condemning the government of Iran for its persecution of religious minorities. The clerk will read.
H-Res 147, calling for the release of United States citizen Saeed Abedini and condemning the government of Iran.
Without objection, the measure is considered read and open for amendment at any point. I thank the author of this bill, Bill Cassidy, for bringing forth this important legislation this afternoon. Despite Rouhani's rhetoric and his charm offensive, every indication is that he continues in his predecessor's footsteps and has not halted or even curbed the regime's systematic and widespread human rights violations. Since he took office, the Iranian regime has conducted over 200 executions, with nearly 20 being conducted in public, and has renewed its repression of the media and civil society. Religious minorities have also gotten no reprieve from the regime. Last month, 4 Iranian Christians were sentenced to 80 lashes for drinking sacramental wine during communion. And this past summer, an Iranian Christian convert was sentenced to 10 years in prison for distributing Bibles. This past August, an American citizen, Pastor Saeed Abedini, was convicted and given an 8-year sentence for what the regime said was undermining the government. In reality, he was arrested and convicted for preaching his Christian faith. Earlier this month, Iranian authorities transferred Pastor Saeed to a notorious prison that is reserved for Iran's most violent criminals and where his life is in danger on a daily basis. These are not isolated incidents, and it is time for the Iranian regime to end its persecution of religious minorities and immediately release Saeed and others like him. By passing H-Res 147, we will send a strong message to Pastor Saeed, his family, and to the Iranian people who wish to practice their faiths openly and freely. And we stand with them during this time of despair, and we will continue to press for respect of human rights in Iran. Let's bring Pastor Saeed home so that he can reunite with his wife and 2 children where he belongs. I would now like to recognize any member from the Democratic side to speak for Mr. Deutsch in support of the resolution, if they wish. Fearless Leader Cicilline.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I would like to also compliment Mr. Cassidy and say what an important piece of legislation this is and how important it is that we send a very strong message on this issue, and thank the Chair for convening the hearing and calling for the markup.
Thank you, sir. I'd like to recognize any members who seek recognition on the Republican side if they wish to speak. Mr. Cotton of Arkansas is recognized.
I'm proud to sponsor this resolution as well, calling for the release of Pastor Saeed Abedini, who's been arrested and imprisoned since last year. Pastor Abedini traveled to Iran many times over the last 4 years to open an orphanage and preach his Christian faith, all with the approval of the Iranian regime. Since he's been arrested, he's been subject to brutal beatings for nothing more than that ministering, and now he's been transferred to Karaj, a notorious prison where murder is an all too common occurrence. I hope that our administration strongly urges the Iranian regime to release Pastor Abedini so he can be reunited with his family. Unfortunately, though, his case is not isolated. The Iranian regime is a totalitarian theocracy that persecutes Christians and people of other faith as well. This is not something that they do just as an accident of the nature of the regime. This is in the very heart of their regime, to suppress religious freedom of all people in violation of numerous international obligations and treaties. So we have to ensure that Pastor Abedini is released, but also continue to pressure Iran to respect the natural rights of every one of its citizens. I yield back.
Thank you, sir. And any other members wish to seek recognition? If not, we will like to turn to the sponsor, the author of this important resolution, so he could be heard. The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member. Thank you for having me here today to discuss this resolution, and I appreciate the work that the committee has done on this. Mr. Abedini is an American who, while he lived in Iran, converted from Islam to Christianity. He was arrested in July 2012 when he was visiting family and working in a non-sectarian orphanage. The Revolutionary Guard arrested him on charges of activities disruptive to the state. However, when he was sentenced to 8 years in prison, it was due to missionary activities which took place a decade earlier when such activities were illegal in Iran. During his imprisonment, Mr. Abedini reportedly has suffered constant pain, internal bleeding, and has not received sufficient medical care. On more than one occasion, he was taken to the hospital where the physician recommended he be admitted and the government would not allow. On another occasion, a nurse refused to touch him because he is a Christian. As a physician, I find that particularly offensive. To further underline the immediacy of the situation, just last week, Mr. Abedini was transferred to the notorious prison, Rajig Shahar, a prison facility where political prisoners simply disappear and are killed by other prisoners. He has reportedly been placed in a ward that houses murderers, is in a cell with other death row inmates, and is not allowed visitors. When Mr. Abedini's father went to visit, he was denied entry, and the blankets and medications he brought to treat his son's internal bleeding were taken away. His wife, Nogme, has said that she is more concerned now about his safety than at any other time during his imprisonment. This is an American being held hostage by the government of Iran. I ask that you pass this resolution out of committee so that we can increase pressure on Iran to release Mr. Abedini from his wrongful imprisonment and allow him to return back to the United States where he is a citizen and to be reunited with his wife and his young children. I yield back.
Thank you, sir. Seeing no further requests for time and no amendments being offered, the chair now moves that the committee agree to H-Res 147. All those in favor say aye. All opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the measure is agreed to. Without objection, House Res 147 is ordered favorably reported to the full committee, and the staff is directed to make any technical and conforming changes. Thank you, Mr. Cassidy, for this bill. And now we will just take a pause to get our witnesses. Javi, you're out of there. If the witnesses could please take their spot in the dais. And the subcommittee will come to order. I apologize first for being late. So sorry. After recognizing myself and the ranking member Deutsch for 5 minutes each for our opening statements, I will recognize other members seeking recognition for 1 minute. We will then hear from our witnesses, and without objection, the witnesses' prepared statements will be made a part of the record. Members may have 5 days to insert questions and statements for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. Before we begin this afternoon's hearing, I will hand Deputy Assistant Secretary McCurk an envelope and ask that he please deliver it to Secretary Kerry. These are my previous letters to Secretary Kerry pleading for the United States to help the residents of Camps Ashraf and Liberty and to prevent another deadly attack like the one from September at Camp Ashraf, which left 52 dead and 7 hostages who are still missing. Also, a video taken by the residents of Ashraf during the latest assault that I urge Secretary Kerry and all members of this subcommittee to view. And finally, a letter to Secretary Kerry regarding the return of Iraqi Jewish community artifacts that are now on display at the National Archives. In 2003, U.S. and coalition forces found a trove of Iraqi Jewish religious and cultural artifacts being warehoused in the basement of Saddam Hussein's secret police headquarters, and the U.S. subsequently brought them here to the National Archives for restoration, preservation, and display. However, these artifacts are scheduled to be returned to Iraq, where the government will claim possession of these artifacts that were unjustly taken from the Iraqi Jewish community. The U.S. government must not return those stolen treasures to the Iraqi government, but instead should facilitate their return to their rightful owners or their descendants. Therefore, on behalf of me, Congressman Steve Israel, and over 40 of our House colleagues, we ask you, Deputy Secretary McCurk, to personally deliver this letter to Secretary Kerry, and that Department of State ensures that the Iraqi Jewish community does not get robbed again of its collective memory and treasures. Thank you, sir. The chair now recognizes herself for 5 minutes. 2 years ago next month, the United States withdrew our last troops from Iraq, and the American mission in Iraq formally ended. Instead of leaving behind a residual force sizable enough to help maintain the gains we made in Iraq and to continue to assist the Iraqis as they made the important steps toward democracy, the administration dithered, failed to actively seek a resolution to extend our presence in Iraq, and withdrew completely rather than stay engaged. Yet shortly after our last soldier left, President Obama addressed troops at Fort Bragg and said, quote, "We're leaving behind a sovereign, stable, and self-reliant Iraq," end quote. However, what we have seen over the past 2 years, and it has been even more pronounced in the past few months, is that Iraq is far from stable, and it is only getting worse. Increasing sectarian violence fueled by al-Qaeda in Iraq, AQI, also known as the Islamic State of Iraq and al-Sham, is now at a level not seen since 2008 and has led to rising civilian death tolls. According to multiple sources, so far this year, there have been over 7,000 civilian deaths, a number that is more than double for all of last year. And there are now on average 68 car bombings a month, and multiple location attacks are occurring at a much greater frequency. The resurgence of AQI and the Shiite militias threatens to ignite an all-out civil war along ethnic and sectarian lines that could topple the Iraqi government. The violence may spread across Iraq and Syria and could enable al-Qaeda to establish a safe haven from which to attack U.S. interests and the interests of our allies in the region. And with the United States no longer there to act as a deterrent, Iran has quickly moved in to fill the void that we left behind and has been exerting a great deal of influence over Prime Minister Maliki and many of the Shiite factions. This is a very serious cause for concern and a real threat to U.S. national security interests to the region. Maliki and his government have done little to prevent or stop Iranian arms supplies from being flown over Iraq to Assad and his murderous forces in Syria. I've repeatedly urged the administration to press Maliki to be more proactive in stopping these flights that carry military personnel, arms, and equipment to Assad, yet the flights continue. Another example of Iran's influence in Iraq is the continued attacks against the people of Camp Ashraf and Camp Liberty, who, despite being guaranteed safety and security from the government of Iraq and the United Nations, have faced several deadly attacks against their compounds this year. These anti-Iranian regime dissidents have been living in fear every day while agents of Tehran attack their camps without repercussions and without Maliki making any effort to stop the violence. The U.S. must press Maliki and the UN to live up to their obligations under the December 2011 Memo of Understanding and protect the residents of these camps. But there's still a chance to reverse course in Iraq. Next April, Iraq will hold national elections. The U.S. must work with Iraq to ensure that these elections are inclusive, that they are free, fair, and transparent. While Maliki was here to visit President Obama, he made it clear that he wants more U.S. military equipment to help fight the growing terrorist threat. The U.S. must not commit to increased security assistance until Maliki and the Iraqi government show that they are serious about combating the terrorist threat, will provide security to the Camp Ashraf and Liberty residents, and are willing to implement the reforms needed in Iraq to bring democracy and stability while also securing U.S. national security interests. It is time for the administration to get serious about its commitment to a democratic and stable Iraq and to increase U.S. influence in Iraq so that it does not even more closely align itself with Iran and our other enemies. And with that, I'd like to yield to Mr. Cicilline if he would like to represent the Democratic side. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for convening this hearing along with the Ranking Member Deutsch. Since U.S. combat troops withdrew from Iraq in 2011, we have seen limited progress in the building of peace, democracy, and stability. I have very strong concerns about the violence and general unrest in Iraq, especially since the Iraqi people have endured considerable hardships. The United States has worked to assist Iraq in these efforts, but internal and regional issues persist, including threats from al-Qaeda. Unfortunately, these threats are very real and very serious, especially as we continue to encounter and handle many complicated issues in the region, particularly with Iran and Syria. I believe the United States must work to forge as strong and allied a relationship with Iraq as possible, but also recognize the ultimate responsibility of the Iraqi people for the stability, prosperity, and peace of their own nation. I look forward to hearing the perspectives of the witnesses we have assembled to discuss the future of our relationship with Iraq, what we can learn from our actions over the last decade, and how they will help to shape our relationships with Iraq and other nations in the region. And I welcome the witness.
Thank you, Mr. Cicilline. Mr. Shabbat is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think we'd be remiss if, before I have my opening remarks, if we could recognize our former colleague, Congressman Mike Flanagan from Chicago, Illinois, who served his constituents extremely well. When I first came up here in '94, it's just one great American there. Why don't you stand up, Mike? Mike Flanagan, all right. And now my statement, the United States spent nearly a decade securing and helping to build the foundation of a prosperous and democratic Iraq. Thousands of American lives were lost, billions of dollars were spent. In 2011, when we were preparing for the transition from a Defense Department-led mission to a State Department-led mission, many of us in the Congress expressed concerns that a complete withdrawal of our armed forces personnel would be premature because Iraq did not appear to be ready to stand on its own, and that we ran the risk of squandering much of the progress that we had achieved. Having just returned from a recent visit there back in 2011, I was one of those members who expressed that skepticism. When President Obama surprised nearly everybody, including our military leaders and many of our diplomats, by withdrawing all of our military personnel while the political situation in Iraq remained dangerously unstable, I'm afraid our worst fears are being realized. 2 years later, Iraq may well be on the verge of a civil war. I'm looking forward to the testimony this afternoon with the hope that the administration can shed some light on its Iraq policy. And I yield back the balance.
Thank you, Mr. Shabbat. Mr. Vargas is recognized.
Thank you very much again, Madam Chair and ranking members, for the opportunity to speak here today and for this important meeting. Nearly 2 years ago, as it was said, the United States withdrew our last troops from Iraq. The main territorial, political, and economic divisions within the country remained ripe and unresolved. Increased sectarian violence and the inability of the Maliki government to govern in a transparent and inclusive manner have left a power vacuum all too often filled by al-Qaeda and Iranian influences, and we see Iraq careening towards a civil war. And importantly now, too, the critical lessons that we learned or didn't learn and the insights that we learned in Iraq will be important also as we advance our negotiations with Afghanistan towards a final bilateral security agreement. And I do have to ask, as many of my constituents ask, was it all worth it? Was it worth it? Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Wilson of South Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you very much for having this hearing today. I'm very grateful that over the years of my service, and I had the opportunity to visit Iraq 11 times, I'm very hopeful for the people of Iraq, but I obviously am very concerned, and I certainly hope the administration is making every effort to avoid what we've already heard could be an impending civil war where you have the Sunni-Shiite divide, where you have an extraordinary example of progress that I have observed in the Kurdish region of Iraq. What a model, hopefully, for the rest of the country to be able to have diversity. It's also personal to me. My oldest son served for a year with the field artillery in Iraq, and he was military police and traveled the country in different convoys. Additionally, my second son has been a doctor serving with the Rangers and the SEALs in Iraq, and so our family wants success. Thank you.
Thank you for their service. And I'm now pleased to yield 5 minutes for his opening statement to the ranking member of our subcommittee, my Florida colleague, Mr. Deutsch.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thanks for holding this hearing. First, I'd like to recognize the Iraqi ambassador who's here today. Thank you for being here, Ambassador. We look forward to working with you to help to ensure a stable and democratic Iraq. It's been 2 years since U.S. forces withdrew from Iraq, and we would be remiss if we didn't remember the tragic sacrifices that so many of our bravest have suffered. 8 long years of war resulted in the deaths of 4,500 U.S. troops. More than 32,000 troops were wounded, including thousands who are now living with brain and spinal injuries. Their sacrifices will always be remembered and greatly appreciated. Yet since the troop withdrawal, sectarian violence has been spiraling out of control, with violence at the highest level since 2006. This has left many wondering what exactly has changed in Iraq. Reports indicate that nearly 7,000 Iraqis have been killed this year, with almost 1,000 killed in September alone. Many believe that the rise in sectarian violence to be a result of efforts by Prime Minister Maliki to consolidate political power at the expense of Sunni and Kurdish opponents. This perspective, along with the dangerous reemergence of al-Qaeda in Iraq, has contributed to Sunni extremists targeting Shia communities, which in response has led to government-run security operations in Sunni areas. All of this contributing to a violent cycle that appears to only be intensifying, with no immediate solution in sight. Yet we can't look at U.S. policy toward Iraq in a vacuum. We must also do so in the context of the broader region. The United States has our fair share of challenges in the Middle East, but a constructive relationship with Iraq, one that is united in our fight against extremists and committed to upholding democracy, can have significant impact on a region in turmoil. Iraq can play a critical role in resolving the conflict in Syria, stopping the spread of extremism, preventing nuclear Iran, and encouraging new regional partnerships. Furthermore, by virtue of its geography and history, Iraq will arguably play the most important role in helping to address the alarming sectarian division between extremist Sunni and Shiite elements that's spreading throughout the region. But I'm troubled by Prime Minister Maliki's neutrality in the Syrian conflict. I'm worried that Iraq is increasingly susceptible to Iranian influence. Earlier this spring, many of my colleagues joined me in sending a letter to Secretary Kerry that expressed our serious concerns that Iranian flights were continuing to use Iraqi airspace to transport weapons to Assad's forces in Syria. And while the Iraqi government responded after months of prodding by grounding several flights, it's unclear whether these Iranian flights continue to go unchecked. And I look forward to hearing whether there has been any progress on this issue. For the past decade, Iraq dominated U.S. foreign policy. We can't allow it to now disappear into our rearview mirror. The challenges in stabilizing Iraq are great, but I believe the risk of letting Iraq devolve into al-Qaeda's playground are even greater. I recognize that developing an effective and sustainable power-sharing agreement between the Shiites, Sunnis, and Kurds is not easy, but we must encourage and promote dialogue. I also recognize that despite Iraq's political challenges, they've made drastic improvements in their economy. Iraq is now the second highest oil producer in OPEC, and the GDP has increased by about 10% per year since 2011. These are the kind of important gains that will be crucial to long-term stability. Another key benchmark in Iraq's future will be the upcoming national parliamentary elections scheduled for April 2014. It's my hope that elections will bring a new political order that works to govern inclusively and effectively. I look forward to hearing what the State Department is doing to help maintain an inclusive political process and to strengthen democratic institutions. Deputy Assistant Secretary McGurk, I hope that today you'll be able to provide greater insight into the future of U.S.-Iraq relations. And while there's no doubt the current security situation is absolutely untenable, this relationship cannot be built solely on arms sales. We can strengthen economic and cultural ties that will help to provide a more prosperous future for all Iraqis, and we must promote a process that results in a lasting and equitable power-sharing agreement that is fair to all Iraqis. Madam Chairman, again, thank you for holding this hearing, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you for an excellent opening statement. We turn to Mr. Weber for any opening statement he'd like to make.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have none at this time.
We'd like to hear that. Then
I
we'll
do
go
too.
Let me see. Mr. Meadows, is that who's next to you there? It's a good-looking guy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Very briefly, just wanted to thank you for coming to testify. Obviously, we need to use all our diplomatic tools necessary to avoid a civil war and prevent the spread of violence there in Iraq. And even though we have the oversight responsibility and connections with the U.S. ambassador over key Iraqi developments and the sale of arms, et cetera, I look forward to your testimony on how we can best accommodate and work with what's happening on the ground there, work with the Iraqi people in a spirit of friendship and cooperation. And I yield back.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Schneider is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'll be brief so we can get to our panel. But as we sit here 2 years after the last troops left Iraq,
Iraq continues to be a linchpin in the Middle East, in many respects influencing the fortune of its neighbors. Thus far, Iraq has not used this opportunity well and has engaged in behavior that sows regional instability rather than security. In April, I joined with many of my colleagues here in the Foreign Affairs Committee in writing a letter to the Prime Minister al-Maliki of Iraq, asking that he do more to stop the illicit arms trafficking in Iranian weapons to the Assad regime in Syria. It remains unclear if Iraq continues to perform inspections of civilian aircraft and may continue to promote regional conflict by allowing these arms to flow from Iran into Syria. I look forward to hearing from our panel on what more can be done to work with Iraq to promote U.S. foreign policy goals in the region, including working towards long-term stability and security in Iraq. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back my time.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Rohrabacher is recognized.
Thank you very much. Madam Chairman, Iraq is now an ally of the Iranian mullah dictatorship. The Maliki Iraq regime is at best an accomplice to the murders of unarmed refugees at Camp Ashraf, and is a regime that has a disdain for the American sacrifice that gave them, the sacrifice of our blood and our treasure that freed them from Saddam Hussein's dictatorship. These ingrates should not receive one penny, not one red cent of American aid. And today we have with us, Madam Chairman, someone who exemplifies the actual horror story that it is under this regime. We have Afzal, and I hope I pronounce this right, Afzal Maini, whose brother was among the 52 killed at Camp Ashraf and has a cousin who is now being held hostage by the Iraqi regime. He resides in my district, and I'd like him to stand now if he could. And we're sorry for your family, and they are in our thoughts as we preside over this hearing. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Meng is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, Ranking Member Deutsch, and our distinguished panelists. It's been 2 years since the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Iraq, and while we have done much to give its fledgling democratic government a real chance of success in the upcoming 2014 national elections, there are still many challenges. Sectarian violence and regional conflicts remain rampant, while our ability to work with the Iraqi government through the Office of Security Operation has greatly diminished. And with rising Iranian influence in Iraq, the need for a comprehensive and clearly defined foreign policy is vital. I'm confident that today's discussion of these issues will prove valuable in determining the appropriate role of the U.S. presence in Iraq going forward. Regarding the issue of Iraqi Jewish artifacts that are currently on display in the National Archives, I want to especially acknowledge and thank Congresswoman Ros-Lehtinen, Congressman Israel, and Senator Schumer for their leadership on this issue. Rescued from Baghdad in 2003, the collection of ancient artifacts include letters, books, and personal photos that were left behind by Jews after World War II, who experienced extreme anti-Semitism, including harassment and violence. It's imperative that these artifacts are returned to the descendants of the Jewish community from which they were wrongly confiscated, and not the Iraqi government. We must ensure justice for the Iraqi Jewish community. I look forward to hearing Mr. Brett McGurk's testimony on these issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now our subcommittee is so pleased to welcome a gentleman who has an impressive resume, Mr. Brett McGurk, who is Deputy Assistant Secretary for Iraq and Iran at the State Department. Prior to this, Mr. McGurk served as a special advisor to 3 U.S. ambassadors to Iraq in the Obama administration, and as Director for Iraq and Special Assistant to the President, as well as Senior Director for Iraq and Afghanistan in the Bush administration. Welcome, Mr. McGurk. We look forward to your testimony, and your full and complete statement will be made a part of the record. You're recognized for 5 minutes, sir. Welcome.
Thank you, Chairman Ros-Lehtinen, Ranking Member Deutsch, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me to discuss the situation in Iraq. My testimony this afternoon will focus on our efforts to safeguard U.S. interests in this important country, bearing in mind our obligations to build on all that America has sacrificed over the past decade. The challenges are daunting. Internally and regionally, pressure continues to build. The next year in Iraq may be pivotal, particularly with national elections now set for April 30th, 2014. I look forward to working closely with this subcommittee as we navigate this difficult terrain and ensure that core U.S. interests are protected. Our policy is focused on these core interests and organized along the following 5 lines of effort. First, maintaining a unified and federal Iraq. Second, supporting increases in the production and export of oil resources. Third, promoting Iraq's strategic independence and regional integration. Fourth, countering the reemergence of al-Qaeda in Iraq. And fifth, supporting Iraq's democratic institutions and trajectory. I will review briefly our efforts along these tracks, measuring progress from Secretary Kerry's March visit to Baghdad. After that visit, the Secretary asked me to travel to Iraq, and I have made 4 trips since, with another scheduled for next week. I hope, therefore, to provide an overview of the situation as viewed from here in Washington, as well as on the ground in Iraq. The first line of effort is maintaining a unified and federal Iraq. The focus here primarily is on relations between the central government in Baghdad and the Iraqi Kurdistan region, or IKR. When the Secretary visited Iraq in March, tensions were at a dangerous boil. Kurdish ministers and parliamentarians were boycotting Baghdad, and Kurdish Peshmerga forces faced off against the Iraqi army in disputed boundary areas. Intensive diplomatic engagement led to a détente, with both sides pulling back, and disputes returning to the political arena where they belong. Since then, 7 joint committees have been formed between Baghdad and Erbil. Prime Minister Maliki has visited Erbil, and President Barzani of the IKR has visited Baghdad for the first time in 2 years. The second line of effort, importantly, is maintaining increases in production and export of oil resources. Iraq is estimated to have the 5th largest proven oil reserves in the world. Last year, it surpassed Iran as OPEC's 2nd largest producer. Earlier this year, Iraq surpassed Iran as a leading exporter to India and China, which has helped enforce robust international sanctions on Iranian oil exports. Today, we are working with the Iraqis on a strategic vision for their national infrastructure, with export routes from the south in Basra to the Red Sea and through Turkey to the Mediterranean. We are also working with all political blocs to pursue a long-term win-win agenda, with Iraq as a 6 to 10 million barrel per day producer, with revenue-sharing pacts and export routes to unite disparate interests in Iraq and regionally. The third line of effort is promoting strategic independence and regional integration. Iraq shares a 400-mile border with Syria and a 900-mile border with Iran, which we learned from hard experience can be difficult to control. In addition, at the time of Secretary Kerry's visit to Baghdad, tensions with Turkey, lingering disputes with Kuwait, and strained relations with the GCC threatened to further isolate Iraq and widen the door to nefarious influences from other neighbors. Thus, beginning in March, we launched a quiet but active campaign to ease tensions with Turkey, settle accounts with Kuwait, strengthen ties to Jordan, and accelerate efforts to reintegrate Iraq with its Gulf neighbors. These efforts have seen some success. In June, the UN Security Council voted to normalize relations between Iraq and Kuwait. This week, Turkey's foreign minister visited Baghdad for the first time in 2 years, and both countries agreed to restore positive ties. Jordan and Iraq are now coordinating efforts to develop the pipeline from Basra to Aqaba, and next week, the UAE will host a strategic dialogue between the United States, Iraq, Jordan, and Egypt. Iraq has also participated recently in regional military exercises in Jordan and Bahrain. While these are positive steps, Iraq's full reintegration with Gulf partners will be influenced by its stance on this conflict in Syria, which is a daily topic of our discussion with Iraqi leaders. The fourth line of effort is countering the reemergence of al-Qaeda in Iraq. Everything I've just mentioned depends on Iraq stemming the rising levels of violence seen over the last year. So far this year, nearly 6,000 Iraqis have been killed, compared with 4,400 who were killed in each of the past 2 years. Nearly all high-profile mass casualty attacks, the vehicle and suicide bombs, are perpetrated by terrorist groups now led by Iraq's al-Qaeda affiliate, the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, or ISIL. ISIL is led by Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, a specially designated global terrorist under U.S. law who is now based in Syria. Earlier this year, Baghdadi announced a campaign of terror to include attacks against Iraqi security services, government targets, and civilians. Since then, we have seen upwards of 40 suicide bombers per month in Iraq, targeting playgrounds, mosques, markets, and funerals, in addition to government sites from Basra to Baghdad to Erbil. These attacks, in turn, have given rise to new calls from Shia extremist militias, which had remained dormant since 2011. ISIL has benefited from a permissive operating environment due to inherent weaknesses of Iraqi security forces, poor operational tactics, and popular grievances, which remain unaddressed in Sunni areas. Fortunately, we have defeated this enemy before, through intelligence-driven security operations and mobilizing popular forces against extremist networks. Iraqi leaders today are working to develop the same approach, with our support, but not our troops, and this remains a daily topic of our conversation with them from the Prime Minister on down. Finally, the fifth line of effort is supporting Iraq's democratic institutions and trajectory. Isolating extremists will be near impossible if the political process is not moving forward. The Iraqi parliament just last week passed a long-delayed law to govern national elections, which are now set for April 30th, 2014. We have made clear to all Iraqi contacts that these elections must be on time, well-prepared, and designed to produce a genuine and credible result. In the meantime, we are engaged with all parties and blocs to facilitate progress in Parliament on a package of laws to advance national reconciliation. In conclusion, vital interests are at stake in Iraq. Hearings like this are critically important to ensuring that we are doing all we possibly can to safeguard those interests and to ensure that we build on the sacrifice we've made over the last decade. Thank you again for inviting me to speak with you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, sir. And before I begin my question, I'd like to recognize Lieutenant Colonel Greg McCarthy and Matt Zweig, two Iraqi war veterans who serve on our Foreign Affairs Committee. We thank you for your service. Mr. McCurk, thank you for your testimony, and you testified in your written statement that it is legitimate to question Iraq's independence given Iran's ongoing use of Iraqi airspace to resupply the Assad regime. Why is Iraq not doing more to stop the overflights to Assad? Is the Maliki government trying to use this issue as a means to try to coerce the U.S. into providing Maliki more arms and advanced weapons systems? Also, you testified in your statement that the State Department is watchful of Iranian efforts to use Iraq in order to circumvent international sanctions. To what extent has Iraq been successful in that? There are also fighters flocking into Syria to fight on, well, could be both sides, but really all sides of that conflict. There are reports that suggest that there are members of the Maliki government who are allowing some Iraqis to cross into Syria to join the fight. Why is the Iraqi government unwilling to stop these extremists from joining ranks with those fighting in Syria? And does the Maliki government's refusal to denounce Assad show that his ties with Iran run deep and that he does not want to upset the regime in Tehran? And lastly, at the start of the hearing, I handed you an envelope filled with letters and a video, and I'd like you to address the issues in the letters. Will the State Department reevaluate its decision to hand these Jewish artifacts over to the Iraqi government and instead work to facilitate the safe and rightful return of these important artifacts to their rightful owners or their descendants? Also, the plight of the residents of Camp Ashraf and Camp Liberty has been tragic, but the situation is getting worse. This year, we saw several deadly attacks, including the previously mentioned attack at Ashraf in September that left 52 dead and 7 hostages captured. What has the U.S. done to ensure that the government of Iraq lives up to its obligation to protect these residents? And why have we not insisted that the thousands of T-walls needed to protect the camp be installed? To date, I'm told that only 192 of the 17,500 T-walls have been installed. This is woefully inadequate, and more needs to be installed by the end of this year, and I respectfully request and would appreciate a regular progress report to our subcommittee on the installment of these protective T-walls. Thank you, sir.
Madam Chairman, first, I will make sure that your letter gets to the Secretary, and this is a daily topic of conversation with all the issues in Iraq, but let me kind of go through issue by issue. I'll start with the Jewish archives. And as you know, the archives are now on display at the National Archives. I went to see them last week. It is really a remarkable display, both about the Jewish heritage and the tragic history of this community in Iraq. We are also in a daily conversation with the Iraqi government and with the Jewish community here in Iraq. This morning, I was in communication with Rabbi Baker from the American Jewish Council. I've also been in regular conversation with Ambassador Faley, who's here representing the Iraqi government. As you know, we have a commitment under an agreement from 2003 to return the archives to Iraq next summer, by the end of next summer. We have paid for Iraqi archivists who are now here training with the National Archives to make sure that these archives are preserved and protected.
And we thank you, sir. I know other members will follow up, but my time is so limited, about Iran and Syria and Camp Ashraf.
I'll say just briefly on the archives. We're open to discussion about discussing the disposition of these archives, and I know the ambassador agrees with that, and I'm happy to discuss that further. On the MEK, this is an issue that I am tracking every single day. On the tragic attack on September 1st, I went to Iraq shortly thereafter. We worked very hard to get the remaining survivors off of Camp Ashraf where they were not safe. I visited the residents and the survivors at Camp Liberty. We're determined to keep them as safe as possible. But
And the
most importantly,
T-walls,
get them
do
out
you
of
think
Iraq.
that we
The
can do
T-walls,
more?
yes, thank you. I just spoke with
They're just stacked up there.
Ambassador Beecroft this morning. The numbers, there's about 1,400 large T-walls now. We want to get as many T-walls in as possible. Some of this comes down to logistics. Some of it comes down to getting the right contractor. Some of it comes down to getting the right meeting in place for where the T-walls go. But there's no excuse. The T-walls need to move into the camp.
Thank you. And on Iran's influence in Iraq and Syria.
Iran has influence in Baghdad. We have influence in Baghdad. Other states in the region have tremendous influence in Baghdad. The issue of overflights, Madam Chairman, I'd really welcome the opportunity to come and brief you in a classified setting. I can go into some detail on the numbers and the flights and what's on the
Thank you.
plane.
And my time is up, but we will do that, sir. Thank you. Mr. Deutsch is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I'd actually like to get back to the issue of the archives. And you said that you're open to discussion. These are just a couple of observations, and I appreciate the attention that you've paid to this issue already. Iraq, Babylon, was the center of Judaism for 1,000 years. And these documents, tattered as they were, found now a decade ago, are, according to the agreement that was reached with the Coalition Provisional Authority, we're supposed to be sent back to a place where the number of Jews numbers perhaps in the single digits. The documents, many of the documents are very personal in nature, records of the community, things that are of real value to the members of the community and their descendants who simply aren't there. So I understand what the agreement was. You also said you're now open to discussion. Can we explore that a little bit? And if you could just continue where you left off, what discussion can we have, and what can we do? What would be the holdup to ensure that these items that are so personal to the community that is no longer living in the country can actually reside with the community where it now lives?
All I'll say right now is that first I think everybody should go see the exhibit, and if you meet the technicians who actually traveled to Baghdad in the heart of one of the worst periods of the war in 2003 to preserve these materials, it's really truly remarkable effort by the National Archives. The State Department was proud to be a partner with them in that effort. They will be on display at the archives. They will then be on display in New York. The commitment that we made in 2003, and that was a legal agreement to allow us to get them out of Iraq to preserve this important material. Without that agreement, the material never would have been preserved. They will be on display in New York, and then under this commitment, they will transfer to Baghdad in the late summer of next year. All I can say is that we have an agreement with the Iraqi ambassador here to begin a conversation about longer-term loans here in the United States to make sure that people can view them, but that'll be an ongoing course of discussion. It's November now. We have until the end of next summer, so we do have some time to discuss this. We have heard very loudly and clearly the concerns from the community. We've listened to those. We've taken them to heart, and we'll see what we can do.
And I would just add to that, there are, as I understand it, some 2,700 books, tens of thousands of documents. It certainly seems that that it would be possible to be able to have the ability to highlight the community that existed in Iraq in some fashion, while still ensuring that the bulk of these records continue to stay with those who are the most closely affiliated with them and whose lives they reflect. So I appreciate that, and to the extent that that conversation is ongoing, there are a lot of us here who offer ourselves up to be engaged in it. So I thank you for that. I'd also like to just follow up. There was an op-ed in the New York Times that coincided with, it was in an op-ed in the New York Times that coincided with his visit to the U.S. Prime Minister Maliki blamed the growing sectarian violence on al-Qaeda's increased influence. And 2 weeks ago, the Washington Post reported growing concern over an al-Qaeda affiliated group, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, that is described as more extreme than Jabhat al-Nusra. So what can the U.S. do to strengthen Iraq's ability to counter these threats, and how do we foster the kind of dialogue that ultimately is necessary for regional cooperation in order to prevent the growing extremism, and can that be done at all? How do we lead it?
Thank you. It's a critical question, because one of the vital interests we face in Iraq is this reemergence of these al-Qaeda groups. We had very intense discussions with the Prime Minister when he was here last week about approaching this with a holistic strategy. The way we went at this in 2007, 2008 was by mobilizing popular forces, the Sons of Iraq and Anbar and Nineveh provinces, for example. This can not only be a security-driven exercise. We believe we now have an agreement with the Iraqis in terms of how to go about this problem and isolating these groups. But make no mistake, the Iraqis need security assistance. As I put in my written testimony, I describe what's happening now. We can help the Iraqis identify some of the al-Qaeda camps, and the camps do exist in the western regions of the country, but they are not able to effectively target those camps. They have unarmored helicopters. When they fly in unarmored helicopters to these camps, the helicopters are getting shot down. Pilots that we've trained are getting killed. The Iraqis, over the course of this year, about 938 members of their Iraqi security forces have been killed in action. So this is a very serious problem. While the security element of the strategy is not the lead element, it is an essential element. And that's why we need to help the Iraqis as best we can. We're helping them with information sharing, and we're talking about training some of their forces in Jordan and working with regional partners. The visit of the Turkish Prime Minister to Baghdad was very important. The strained relationship between Baghdad and Ankara was having an impact in the internal environment of Iraq. So getting that relationship on a better track is very important, and we're going to keep working to isolate these groups. In terms of sectarian violence, the violence we've really seen in 2011 and 2012, there was about 100 attacks a week, and they were primarily conducted almost entirely by the Sunni extremist al-Qaeda type groups. What we've seen this year is the violence has gone up. And again, 40 suicide bombers a month, that's compared with about 5 a month in 2011 and 2012. And those suicide bombers are having a devastating effect because they're able to go in and target restaurants and playgrounds and just having a psychological effect on the country. And that is leading for a renewed call for Shia extremist militias to form to protect local neighborhoods. And this is extremely dangerous. We discussed it with the Prime Minister in great detail. He agrees that this is a very serious problem. He also agrees that we have to go about this politically, economically, and with information-driven, intelligence-driven security operations. So we think we've made progress about a common strategy to go after this, but this is going to be a day-by-day and very hard work.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Deutsch. Mr. Shabbat is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. McGurk, you had mentioned in your testimony that Iraq may account for nearly half of the anticipated growth in global oil output over the current decade. Can we be sure that the existing agreements over oil production will be honored in the event of more domestic instability in Iraq? And can you elaborate on how Iraq's oil production will be affected in the event social unrest continues to fester?
Congressman, it's an excellent question, because the more the security situation deteriorates, that jeopardizes the ability of the Iraqis to get that oil onto global markets. I want to say what we've been doing with the Iraqis is trying to focus them on using their abundant natural resources in a strategic way. The problems that beset Iraq are not problems that developed over the last year, even the last decade or 100 years. They go back, in some cases, 1,000 years. We're talking with the Iraqis and having a very good conversation with the regional partners about how to harness their natural resources to align the interests both internally and within the region in a stable, unified, and federal Iraq. For example, having strategic pipelines that run from Basra to the Haditha refinery in the heart of Anbar province, and then south through Jordan to the Red Sea, unites the Shia in the south, the Sunnis in Anbar province, and Jordan's real intense need for energy resources. Connecting that pipeline further, and this is a discussion that Foreign Minister Davutoglu had with the Prime Minister in Baghdad last week, from the Haditha refinery to the Beja refinery also in Saladin province, and then to Turkey, unites the interests of Turkey all the way down to the south and southern Iraq, and that's something the Turkish Foreign Minister also pointed out. We're also working with the Kurds and with the Iraqis in Baghdad to make sure that this is done in a strategic way and done with revenue-sharing pacts that all Iraqis can share in their national patrimony. But this is very difficult. The maxim we use, and it's one that is really enshrined in the Iraqi constitution, is that all the oil is owned by all the Iraqi people, but that it's it's better to peacefully divide a large pie than to fight over a small one. Right now, Iraq is producing about 3 million barrels a day. That is more than it has produced in almost 20 years. But there's projections from the International Energy Agency that Iraq, if it gets its act together and does some things right, should be producing 6 million barrels a day by 2020. And we want to help the Iraqis get there.
Thank you. Let me shift gears here. While Iraqi Christians find themselves in an increasingly hostile environment, the Kurdish region was seen as a safe haven for Christian refugees in Iraq. However, a number of bombings against Christians in the Kurdish region have changed the security situation for Christians, and with reports of discrimination, Christians no longer feel safe, even in the Kurdish region. What's the administration doing to help Christians and other minorities in Iraq, and what is the Maliki government doing to protect Iraqi religious minorities?
Thank you. Very important question. And at the State Department, also, we are focused on this every single day. I try to meet with the Iraqi Christian communities here in the United States. When I'm in Iraq, I try to meet with the Christian leaders. Our ambassadors engage with them on a regular basis. On my last trip, I met with Bishop Warda, who's in Erbil in the Kurdish region, and we asked him, what do you really need from us? And he needed some more facilitation with the Kurdish government there to resolve some land disputes, and they have now set up a joint commission to do just that. The Prime Minister met Archbishop Sacco, the main Christian leader in Iraq, in early October to talk about the threats to the Christian community. The real problem in Iraq right now is that every community is under tremendous threat. The casualties that have taken place this year are a threat to everybody, but the Christians in particular and some of the other minority communities such as the Shabaks and the Yazidis are under real threat from these al-Qaeda groups. We are talking with the Iraqi Christian community here and also Christian leaders in Baghdad about what we can do to harness local forces to protect their local communities, and then working with the Iraqi government to get resources into those communities. And we've made some progress over the last 3 to 4 months, but our eyes are wide open to how difficult this problem is. And again, the more that this al-Qaeda network gains strength and gains roots in western Iraq, the greater the threat will be. That's why we have to go after that in a very serious way.
Thank you. Madam Chair, I'll yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Connolly is recognized.
I thank the Chair. What is the relationship, Mr. McGurk, in your view, between the government in Tehran and Mr. Maliki's government in Baghdad?
It's a relationship that is really multifaceted. I mean, if you just look at that border, Iraq is going to have cultural, religious, economic relations with Iran. That's something we recognize. Where we try to draw a line is any sort of security relationship with Iran, and we've had some success in that area. My experience over the last decade in working with Iraqis, whether Shia, Sunni, Kurds, Christians, everybody, is that there's really no love lost between Iraqis and Iran. They remember the very long Iran-Iraq war in the 1980s, and that is really felt very deep in the psychology. Iraq also feels...
Can I interrupt you 1 second? And you would say that that view is also shared by the Maliki government, despite the Shia nature of that government?
Sometimes it's a mischaracterization to say that Shia in Iraq are linked to Shia in Iran. They have religious ties, but the Shia in Iraq and Grand Ayatollah Sistani in Najaf and his philosophy of quietism is totally 180 degrees opposite to the philosophy of Khomeini and Khamenei in Tehran, which is kind of clerical rule. Sistani's view is that more of a democratic tradition, which we would recognize, in which there should be separation from the top clerical leadership in the government. That is something that most Iraqis adhere to, and it's a critical distinction to really working with this problem. Make no mistake, Iranian influence in Baghdad is very strong. It is there every day. They've had a presence in Baghdad for 10 years. I've had the same people there who've built relationships that are very deep, and it's something we need to deal with. We have to recognize they're going to have a relationship. It's drawing a line at the malign and nefarious influences from Iran, which we're trying to do.
Thank you. I think that's a really important distinction. I'm glad you got it in the record. Kurdistan, well, the Kurdish area in the north, has actually sort of had protected autonomy for going back to right after the first Gulf War by the United States. Is not correct?
Yes.
And it's actually flourished as a result, not only of our protection, but of its own enterprise and initiative. Is that correct?
Yes.
And has largely been spared some of the violence in the rest of Iraq, both pre, during, and post-U.S. invasion.
Yes, correct.
Recently, the Kurds seem to have come to an agreement with the government of Turkey to build a pipeline directly to Turkey to provide, I think, largely natural gas. Is that correct?
There's a debate whether it's going to go directly to Turkey or whether it's going to plug into the existing pipelines that exist already. The oil pipeline is going to plug into the existing Iraq-Turkey pipeline, which is on the Kurdish side of the border.
Right. But the Turks and the Kurds have been talking about a direct pipeline that would actually bypass the national system in Iraq, if I understand it correctly.
There's been a lot of discussion,
Right.
a lot of press reports and industry reports, but I think actually looking at where the pipelines are going, right now the oil pipeline is going to plug in on the Kurdish side, and we have not seen a clear indication there's going to be an independent pipeline.
Well, those same reports you're referring to, Mr. McGurk, also report that the United States government has been pretty active, if not animated, on this topic, discouraging the bypassing of the national pipelines because, your point earlier, it would diminish the nation's cohesion that we're trying to seek in Iraq. Would that be an accurate?
That's not entirely accurate, and thank you for letting me address that. It's our position that as much oil and natural gas from the Kurdish region should get onto global markets as soon as possible. Full stop. That's our position. We look at this very closely, though, and want to make sure that it is done in a way that does not have a repercussion or backlash that could jeopardize getting to the point where I talked about in my testimony that Iraq is a 6 to 10 million barrel a day producer, though that's a long-term vision. And this is a very politically fraught issue in Iraq. We don't take sides. We look to the Iraqi Constitution as the baseline. We try to make sure that this is being done and managed in a strategic way. But it's our position we want as much oil and gas from the Kurdish region getting onto global markets as soon as possible.
And presumably one other factor is we also are not unsympathetic to our longtime ally Turkey in trying to secure its own fossil fuels.
Absolutely right, which is why we are big supporters of a strategic pipeline going from Basra all the way up to Ceyhan in the Mediterranean through Turkey, and having Kurdish pipelines plug into that national infrastructure.
Thank you, sir.
The win-win vision.
Thank you, Mr. Connolly. Mr. Wilson is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here. As I mentioned, I'm very, very grateful that I've had two sons serve in Iraq, Army, Navy. I'm grateful that we've even had members of Congress. My colleague, Congressman Kinzinger, right here, has served twice in Iraq. The American people have shed blood on behalf of the people of Iraq, and we want success and hope for success. Additionally, I've had the opportunity to visit the country 11 times. I've been very impressed by the people I've met, and again, hopeful for the country. But a real tragedy has been the murders at Camp Ashraf. Since December 2008, before our government turned over the protection of the camp to the Iraqi government, Prime Minister Maliki has repeatedly assured the world that it would treat the residents humanely and protect them from harm. Yet it has not kept the promise. As 111 residents have been murdered in cold blood and more than 1,000 wounded in 5 attacks, including the September 1st massacre, what is the United States doing to prevent further attacks and greater loss of life in terms of ensuring the safety and security of the residents?
Congressman, first let me say thank you for your service and your family's service. Speaking for myself and my team, who've spent many years in Iraq and have known friends of ours who we've lost in Iraq, it's something we think about every day, and it inspires our work and our determination to do everything possible to succeed under very difficult circumstances. Regarding Camp Ashraf and Camp Liberty, the only place for the MEK and the residents of Camp Liberty to be safe is outside of Iraq. Camp Liberty is a former U.S. military base. We lost Americans right nearby there as late as the summer of 2010. We lost a number of Americans to rocket fire and indirect fire attacks on our embassy compound, one of the most secure facilities in the country, as late as the summer of 2010. That is when we had about 60,000 troops in the country doing everything we possibly could to hunt down the rocket teams that we knew were targeting us. There are cells in Iraq, we believe directed and inspired from Iran, which are targeting the MEK. There's no question about that. And the only place for the MEK to be safe is outside of Iraq. That is why the State Department, the Secretary, has appointed a colleague of mine, Jonathan Weiner, to work this issue full-time to find a place for them to go. Right now, there's about 2,900 residents at Camp Liberty, and Albania has taken in about 210. Germany's agreed to take in 100, and that's it. We need to find a place for these people to go. It is an urgent humanitarian issue, an international humanitarian crisis. And I went to the camp to meet with the survivors, to speak with the families, and I promised them to do everything I possibly could to get them to safety. And in the meantime, it is incumbent upon the Iraqi government to do everything it possibly can to keep them safe, and that means the T-walls and the sandbags and everything else. But the only place for the residents to be safe will be outside of Iraq. Since the tragic attacks at Camp Liberty on September 1st, 1,300 Iraqis were killed. 52 people were massacred at Camp Ashraf. This is a tragic, horrifying act. But since then, 1,300 Iraqis in the country have been killed. The country is incredibly dangerous, and the MEK, to be safe, have to leave Iraq, and we want to find a place for them to go.
Well, I appreciate your commitment to that. After the September 1st massacre, the State Department called for an independent investigation by the United Nations. 74 days on, nothing's been done, let alone an independent investigation. Could you tell this committee whether any independent probe has been carried out or not? If so, by whom, and what is the finding? If not, why not? 5 attacks have been launched against the residents, and not one person has been arrested. What do we do to maintain promises of protection?
Congressman, shortly after the attack, we worked with the United Nations to make sure that they got a team up to Camp Ashraf within 24 hours of the attack to document exactly what happened, because there was a lot of stories about what happened. They went there, took photographs of the bodies to make sure that it was documented as to how these people were killed, and there's no question about it. We have looked very closely at all of our information. I know I've had the opportunity to brief some members of the subcommittee in a classified setting, which I would be pleased to do again to update you on the information that we have. We did call for an investigation and for the UN to be involved in this process. The UN was also involved in making sure that the survivors got out of Camp Ashraf and out of harm's way to Camp Liberty. But again, Congressman, I would welcome the opportunity to come discuss with you in a classified setting exactly everything we know about what happened on September 1st.
And I've been to Camp Liberty many times, but I obviously am concerned. I appreciate your commitment, and indeed, every effort should be made to protect those citizens. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. Mr. Sherman of California is recognized.
I want to thank the chair and ranking member for the opportunity to participate in this hearing. Maliki wants our weapons, yet he allows planes to go from Iran to Syria, taking murderers and thugs and the IRGC and weapons with them. He says that he can't defend his own airspace, but he certainly has not invited Turkey, Saudi Arabia, or the United States to defend that airspace from these murderers that fly leisurely across Iraq and do their killing in Syria. I want to focus on finances. How much money are we scheduled to give Iraq this year? How much do they get from oil? And are they pumping oil as quickly as they can or constraining their production in accordance with OPEC rules?
In terms of money, we're not really giving Iraq much money at all anymore. Our assistance levels have gone down dramatically. But it's still well over $1 billion? No, I believe the most recent request is now under $1 billion. It's gone from about $1.5 billion last year to FY13 is about $880 million. And I can again brief you on the glide path in terms of our overall presence. In terms of oil, it's actually quite the opposite. The Iraqis have done everything possible to get as much oil onto international markets as possible.
So they are pumping as fast.
And the Iranian oil minister last week said that it was an unfriendly act what the Iraqis were doing in terms of getting that much oil onto Iraqi markets. As Iranian oil has come down, thanks to our sanctions, by about 1 million barrels a day, Iraqi oil has gone up by about 800,000 barrels a day, which has really helped stabilize global markets.
As has Libyan production. The Saddam Hussein's government incurred tens of billions of dollars of borrowings Saddam would have wanted to call it gifts from Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and others in the Gulf, which he used to fight the Iran-Iraq war. Has the Iraq government made payments on this debt, renounced the debt, or does it just kind of sit on their balance sheet with no particular explanation?
These are the debts that the Iraqis owe?
This is debts of the Iraqi government to the governments of Saudi Arabia and Kuwait incurred during the Iran-Iraq war.
Some of those debts, as you know, have been forgiven through Paris Club commitments. Other debts have not. I would have to get you the numbers of what is.
Please
I'd
give
be
me
happy to follow
information
up. I'll take that back. Thank you.
Now I'd like to join with Mr. Wilson and others in focusing on Camp Liberty. You had 101 members of the MEK there, 52 were killed. That's a 50% casualty rate roughly, or roughly 1 million times the casualty rate that ordinary Iraqi civilians have faced in the unfortunate deaths that have occurred in Iraq. Included among those who died was the brother of Asaf al-Nia, who I believe is in our audience today. The State Department has issued a statement saying, well, the Iraqi government had nothing to do with it, which to me is an incredible indictment. They have an obligation to protect the residents of the camp, and according to our own State Department, did nothing. In fact, the assailants had to get past several checkpoints in order to carry out their murders. When we were at Camp Liberty, or when we were in Iraq, Camp Liberty had 17,000 of these T-walls that protect those who live in the camp from missiles and mortars. Now there are less than 200. What have we done to make it clear to Maliki that he has to put back the T-walls and provide the defense, or will he keep the people there subject to attack and then disclaim any responsibility when they are in fact attacked?
I want to make clear what the U.S. position is. We've looked at this very closely in terms of having no credible evidence going all the way up to the top of the Iraqi government in terms of this particular attack.
No, but you have no credible evidence that they lifted a finger to stop it.
Iraq, as I've said in my testimony, is an extremely violent place. And a couple months before the Ashraf attack, the Abu Ghraib prison complex was attacked by hundreds of al-Qaeda-linked fighters. And they took over the prison and released almost everyone in the prison. We think in that attack there was no foreknowledge from the highest levels of the Iraqi government. There was probably some complicity at a local level, and we think the Ashraf attack was similar.
So do you think there was complicity at the local level?
I think it's a reasonable assumption there was some.
What about complicity with the failure of Maliki to deploy these 17,500 T-walls?
The T-walls, as you know, when the residents moved into Camp Liberty, it had the same T-wall configuration we had to protect our troops. And the residents, and I can understand why, said this looks like a prison, we want to get the T-walls out, and so all the T-walls came out. Given the threat they're under, the T-walls have been moving back in. There are different numbers on the numbers of T-walls. I was just at the camp about a month or so ago, or a couple months ago, and saw it with my own eyes, and I want to get more T-walls into the camp. And I spoke with Ambassador Beecroft about this just today. And there's an agreement with the Iraqi government to, we have to get the right meeting in place, the right people there for where the T-walls are going to go, and I think we'll see more T-walls moving into the camp. But we're continuing to work it as hard as we can.
Well, we have fewer than 200. We need 17,500. I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from California. You're lit up. Is it?
Thank you very much.
All righty.
All right. Well, where do we start? I just, $880 million in aid after or at least the money that we will be expending for Iraq after spending almost $1 trillion over a decade and 6,000 lives, for which I have seen no gratitude whatsoever from senior members of the Iraqi government, nor from the Iraqi people. Why do we care anymore about whether or not al-Qaeda is operating and killing some of their soldiers? Why do we care They don't care for us. They're not grateful for what we've already done. Why should we be giving even more money to a country that's headed by people of that inclination?
Congressman, thank you. I just want to clarify, the $880 million is our operating request for the current budget for sustaining our presence in Iraq and doing various things we're doing there.
That's right. So why should we do that?
Well, I mean, we have vital interests at stake in Iraq, whether you measure it from al-Qaeda, whether you measure it from the oil production, whether you measure it from just the overall stability of the region. I think withdrawing from Iraq in terms of our overall diplomatic presence and what we're doing would have a really devastating consequence to our longer-term interests. I would point you to an important op-ed the Iraqi ambassador wrote on our Veterans Day, thanking all the sacrifice in Iraq. You know, I would like to see more as well. Again, I have...
Yes, I will have to say that independently, I've never had an experience. I've been in and out of Iraq a number of times and been with a number of Iraqis. Not once did I have someone independently, without being told, to come up to me and say how grateful they are, ever to suggest that. I would suggest that it's a big stretch to say that things going on in some province in Iraq, because there's some al-Qaeda element there murdering other Iraqis, that we need to get involved in that any more than we have in the past. I mean, we're pouring more money down the rat hole, but also it really makes a mockery. This whole thing makes a mockery of the commitment we've had in the past. Let me just ask, you believe then, from what you've said, that there was legitimate security reasons that those T-walls have not been put up at Camp Liberty?
No, I do not think there are legitimate security reasons the T-walls have not been put up.
It sounded to me when I was listening to and I listened very closely to what you said, that we can't blame the leadership in the Maliki leadership for the lack of security at Camp Liberty?
No. In fact, my conversation from Maliki on down is that you need to get as many T-walls into that camp as possible without any excuses. Full stop. So you may have heard me say something different,
Okay,
but it's not
maybe
what
I
want to be very
maybe
clear.
I'm misinterpreting what you said. Now, tell me this: those troops that came into Camp Ashraf and murdered 52 unarmed MEK refugees, do you hold that this was done by a rogue element in the Iraqi army, or do you think that the Maliki regime is complicit in this murder?
I don't believe it was a rogue element. I think a lot of this goes back to the background of the situation. Camp Ashraf was seen as a forward operating base to the MEK.
I don't need a background on it. I'm not trying to find out. It's clear that we had Iraqi soldiers going in there, murdering people who were unarmed, tying their hands behind their back, and then blowing their brains out. This is an atrocity. It's a crime against humanity. Now, I don't need a background to find out that there's, the background on Camp Ashraf. Do we hold that government responsible, or was this a rogue element? And if it was a rogue element in the military, what has the Maliki regime done to deal with that?
Congressman, I would welcome the opportunity to come speak with you in a classified setting and tell you everything we know about this attack, including who committed the atrocity.
I'm not asking for all the information that you know. I'm asking who we're holding accountable, and we aren't. Clearly, we are sending a message to the Maliki government that it's okay, because we're not doing anything about it. Here's a picture of a gentleman who used to work up here, and I submit this now, Mr. Chairman, for the record. A gentleman who used to work right here in Capitol Hill representing the MEK, and we saw him on many occasions, and guess what? Here's his body at Camp Ashraf, where they have murdered him, brutally tied his hands behind his back, and blown his brains out. We need to make sure that if we excuse this by lack of attention, we are sending our own message as to what values we have, and we're sending other dictators and terrorists a message as well about American weakness. I am not satisfied with what this administration is doing on this issue. And one last note, Mr. Chairman, and that is, look, these people are under attack. I think at the very least, and this is my opinion right now on this, we should take the people in at Camp Liberty. Let's just take them in. Is there a reason why I'm writing legislation that would grant these people asylum? Obviously, their lives are at stake, and obviously they are now unarmed refugees. Is there some reason that we should not give them political asylum?
I will say that
Gentleman's time's expired. Do you want to? Maybe you can finish up on one or the other. I'm gonna move it along. I don't see anybody here from the other side of the aisle, so I will recognize somebody from this side of the aisle. Next person in the queue is Mr. Kinzinger from Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. McGurk, thanks for being here, and thanks for your service to your country. I know it's not always easy, but we appreciate what you're doing. Just a couple of questions. As Mr. Wilson so kindly mentioned, I'm a veteran of Iraq and saw quite a bit of sacrifice from the American side in terms of what was created there. And in fact, I think one of the bravest political decisions and frankly military decisions that's been made in 50 years was the surge in Iraq. And I heard a lot of people, including frankly the current administration, oppose the surge, thinking that the war in Iraq is lost. I heard a very powerful person in the Senate say that the war is lost, it's time to go home. And we saw that despite that, a tough decision was made to surge. And the surge, the addition of 20,000 additional troops helped, but what really helped was the message that the United States, the enemy knew we'd never be defeated on the battlefield, and we won't be, but the focus that we're committed. My good friend, Mr. Rohrbacher, I have to take slight exception. I think there's quite a bit at stake in Iraq. I think a resurgent al-Qaeda is extremely concerning in Iraq. I think a resurgent al-Qaeda in a very, frankly, potentially powerful and oil-rich nation is not just not in the interest of the Iraqi people, it's not in the interest of the United States, it's not in the interest of the free world, and it's especially not in the interest of the 6,000 people that gave their lives to help create what was created over there. I was shocked, frankly, at the end of 2011 at the complete pullout of U.S. forces. I thought we could have negotiated much harder for a residual force in Iraq. I think had we left a residual force in Iraq, we would not be seeing the kind of violence we do now. So that said, I don't have a time machine, and I can't go back in time and convince the president that Iraq was in our interest to leave a residual force there. But I do have a couple questions about the resurgent AQI presence in Iraq. The president's claimed numerous times that al-Qaeda has been decimated, but that's not the case, frankly, anywhere around the globe or in Iraq. We're seeing sectarian violence in Iraq today at levels that we saw when I served there, which was completely incomprehensible. Has the administration, in your mind, underestimated the growth, reach, and capacity of al-Qaeda and its affiliates in Iraq?
Congressman, first, thank you for your service, and with all that you've seen, your experience is really critical to getting this right now, and that's why I think this dialogue is very important. I don't want to get into whether it was underestimated. I'm really focused in my job on where we are now, and we face a real problem. There's no question that ISIL is a group that is growing roots in Syria and in Iraq, and the one thing with this Iraqi government, they want to go after this threat, and we want to help them. We want to help them do it in an effective way. As you know from your experience, the reason the surge worked was not just the troops, it was the strategy. And the reason the Sons of Iraq and the Awakening worked was because really three things. We trusted them, we paid them, and they believed they were going to win. Right now, the Iraqis are telling us, and the Minister of Defense, Sadoun Doulemi, who's from Anbar Province, they'll trust them, they can give them resources, but right now they don't think they're going to win because the al-Qaeda groups are out have better weapons and better resources, quite frankly, in some of these areas. So that's a problem we're trying to address.
Okay, thank you. In shaping the future policy towards Iraq, has the administration taken into account recent operations launched by AQI's resurgent effort, including Breaking the Walls and the Soldiers Harvest campaign, in which vehicle-borne IEDs have been used in staggering numbers?
In my testimony, I discussed, I didn't use the exact words, but that is Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi's strategy. He announced it, and then they carried it out. The Breaking Walls campaign was about prisons and attacking security forces, and other as his campaigns was about attacking government targets, including the Ministry of Justice building in downtown Baghdad in March. They attacked the intelligence headquarters in Erbil on September 21st, and they've attacked particularly Shia civilians week after week after week, trying to spark that cycle of sectarian violence that we saw at the worst phases of the war. So far, The Shia militia response has been localized and has not had a strategic effect, but it's something we're watching very closely.
Well, thank you. And just in the last 30 seconds I just want to say for the record, I hope that the administration, and again, we could go back in time and argue whether we should have left a residual force. I've made my point on that. But I hope that in the future we are acting very proactively to help the Iraqi government root out terrorism. I don't know what that's necessarily going to involve. It's some things I don't want to say here, but I think an Iraq that falls prey to al-Qaeda, to lawlessness, frankly, like we saw in the mid-2000s, would be tragic for the United States, for the whole region, and for not only our reputation, but for a lot of people that just want to live in peace. And again, thank you for your service. Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Madam
Thank you
Chair,
so
you're back.
much.
I yield back.
Mr. Kinzinger, we are so proud of your valuable service. Thank you so much. We're very proud of, we have many vets in our subcommittee, and we thank each and every one of them. Mr. DeSantis was one of them. Thank you for chairing while I was out. And Mr. DeSantis is now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. When I had kind of cut off your answer when I was chairman because we were way over time. So do you just want to answer the question that Mr. Rohrabacher had asked you about the administration's position on asylum for these folks?
I'll defer to the lawyers on some of this, but as a former terrorist organization, even though they're no longer designated an FTO, there are legal restrictions in terms of our ability to bring a large number of the group into the United States under existing laws. There are processes that are under discussion, and I'm happy to discuss that with you and follow up, but a legislative fix on some of these issues is something that we would look at.
When I was in Iraq, this was kind of right when the surge had started, back when I was on active duty, and as you know, you were a part of that. You had AQI, Ascendant, 2006 was a disaster, but you also had Quds Force and these Shiite militias wreaking havoc in other parts of Iraq, and the surge was very successful at quelling that. But then as I read what's going on now, it seems like a lot of what's going on is reminiscent of those years. So can you speak to, I know you talked about Iran does have a lot of influence, particularly in Baghdad. Generally, what is the influence of Quds Force and how are they interacting with the Iraqi government, if at all?
I think, and again, you'd recognize from your experience, Congressman, if you charted out right now the levels of violence on just al-Qaeda violence, suicide bombers and vehicle bombs, we are at a level not seen, as the chairman said earlier, since 2008. But if you look at overall violence, it's still down substantially. And what the reason for that is because the Shia militia violence, which we were seeing in those days, has not really responded in a reciprocal tit-for-tat way. So that's really significant. If we see that type of response, it'll be very concerning. The Quds Force, as we see it right now, they do not want Iraq to be destabilized. We do think, however, that they are working with certain Shia militia groups, including Kataib Hezbollah, Sabal Haq, and some of these other groups that you would know well. And they are really focused, though, on a localized kind of mission-by-mission basis. All I can say is that in our conversations with the Iraqis, we share as much information as we possibly can and make very clear that they need to push back against this. Prime Minister Maliki does, remind us that he did take on the militias in Karbala and Basra, and that he's ready to take them on again if necessary. But this is something that we just need to keep pushing. The Iranians have done very malign things in Iraq, particularly when we were present there. Right now, it looks like they don't want to have a destabilized Iraq, but they are also responding to demands from particularly the Shia community for self-protection in ways that might not be particularly helpful.
So in terms of AQI, and I take your point about the level of violence not reaching those 2006 level, which is good, even though it's risen. Back then, you had foreign fighters coming into Iraq fighting as a part of AQI. Now we know Syria is kind of a magnet for a lot of these folks. So is it safe to say that most foreign fighters are now going to Syria, who are the Sunni-aligned foreign fighters? And if that's the case, are they going through Iraq? Are some of these AQI fighters in Iraq, I guess they're playing a pretty big role in facilitating those folks into Syria?
The suicide bombers, we believe, are all foreign fighters. Nearly all of them are foreign fighters. They're coming through the ISIL networks, and they're coming from Syria into Iraq. So we think what happens are these young guys who are brainwashed to go fight a global jihad. They show up in Syria. If you can file a rifle, you go fight. If you're a mechanic, you fix a truck. And if you're just an indoctrinated, you go be a suicide bomber. And about 40 of them now a month are being directed towards Iraq. And the suicide bombers, again, as I said, just have a real devastating effect. In terms of foreign fighters from Iraq going to Syria, both you have a youthful population, you have an underemployed population, and they're all watching this conflict unfold on YouTube with particularly gruesome videos. And that is having a militarizing, radicalizing effect both within the Sunni community and the Shia community. It's one reason why my colleagues on the Syria side of the policy house here are trying to work so hard to settle that issue down.
And then my final question is, does the Iraqi government have a relationship in any way with Hezbollah?
In terms of a formal relationship, none that we've seen in a formalized way.
Okay. Thanks a lot. Yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you so much, Mr. DeSantis. And we save the best for last. And a person who just knows that's just the way it is. So pleased to yield 5 minutes to Judge Poe of Texas.
Thank you, Madam Speaker or Madam Chair. I've been to Iraq a lot. I've seen a lot of people in Iraq. And I met with Maliki. I was with Mr. Rohrbacher. We met with Maliki and we asked him this one question: can we go see the people at Camp Ashraf? And he said, absolutely not. In fact, he got so incensed that we asked that question when we were on a helicopter flying to the north to see the Kurds. He went through the State Department and asked us to leave the country. We were kicked out of the country. So when you see him get a little emotional, and me as well, here we are giving billions to a country where the President or the Prime Minister refuses to let members of Congress see what's taking place in Camp Ashraf. That's the background. 5 attacks on Ashraf and Liberty. 5 over a period of years. Not one criminal has been brought to justice. Not one. We don't even know their names or who they are. If the Iraqis were serious about investigating, they would at least bring in somebody. If those investigators worked for me when I was a prosecutor, they'd have been fired several attacks ago. These people that are here, working people, Americans, and they are concerned about people they love in Iraq. And they constantly are losing friends and family members to attacks. Meanwhile, the United States, I'm not sure what we're doing. I now understand that not any of the witnesses have been talked to about the latest attack. These are real people that are killed. And I'm sorry for the graphicness of this poster, but this has happened to the Camp Liberty, where the people were in the clinic and they were assassinated. They were tracked down and murdered. Now, we would think, being the freedom-loving country we are, that we would be opposed to this type of activity and we would do a little bit more to pressure it because it is our responsibility. You have made the comment that we're not taking these people into the United States because they used to be a foreign terrorist organization, but the State Department, through the Secretary of State, can waive that, as has been done with 12 previous people who came in. When I've talked to other countries about, well, why don't you take these folks from the MEK? You know what the first thing they say is? The United States is hypocritical. They say people ought to take them, but you won't take any of them. Got a good point when we talk to the Germans and the French and the Brits and the people in the Netherlands that they ought to take former MEK members when they say, well, you're not taking any of them. Good. It's an excellent point. I find it hard to believe that the Iraqi security forces were unaware of this attack when they had to go through numerous checkpoints to get to the place where they murdered these folks. The Iraqis are responsible for guarding them, and they were missing in action. They all went on a donut break at the time that these homicides occurred. They're always missing. And there's a debate about the 7 that were taken and captured. I've become a real good fan of the French Foreign Affairs Minister, especially with the last situation where he stopped this bad deal with Iran. But in a letter to some of his people in the Parliament, he makes the comment that as far as he's concerned, these 7 are still in Iraq. My question is, Have these 7 people been rescued, to your knowledge, no matter where they are?
No.
Has anybody in the State Department interrogated the survivors as far as a criminal investigation going on? Have we sent in all of the investigators that we have, or any investigators, to talk about who happened, what these people look like, et cetera, et cetera?
We have turned as much information as we possibly can to find out where these 7 people are, and I'd be happy, as I've done with some members of the subcommittee, brief you in a classified setting.
Okay, that's not my question. My question is, have they been asked specifically about the murders in the camp that they survived, about who they were, what they looked like, what they said, what language they were speaking? Have they been interrogated about those basic criminal investigation questions?
We have asked the contacts with the MEK that we deal with to put their experts and those who have information in touch with our experts, particularly at our embassy, to connect some of the dots.
We've waived 12 and allowed them to come into the United States. Why haven't we waived that for more people who want to come?
Congressman, I want to be very precise in my language. When I mentioned that a legal fix would help, given the FTO designation, we are deliberating internally about our policy regarding entry into the United States, and that this decision hasn't been made. That's why I cannot discuss that further here.
Well, but it's the law, is it not, that the Secretary of State can waive that under the current law right now? That's not any big secret.
There are mechanisms in which a limited number would be able to come into the U.S., yes.
So what do we tell these folks, that freedom-loving folks that are just in a place where they don't want to be? We won't take them. We can't get other countries to take them. And do you know what they're waiting for? The next attack, if we don't hold Maliki accountable. I just want to make this comment. I don't know if you've seen this letter or not, but 44 of us, 22 Democrats and 22 Republicans, have sent a letter to the President of the United States saying no more money to Iraq until there's accountability for the murders in Camp Ashraf. Have you seen that letter?
I have seen that letter.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Thank you very much. You have to end the same way you always end, Judge.
And that's just the way it is.
Thank you. And I teased that we saved the best for last with Judge Poe, but now we've got the best for last on the Democratic side. My good friend from Texas, Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, I'm going to let her take a breath here before she's recognized, so we'll just take a moment break here. Ms. Jackson Lee is recognized.
Let me thank the chairwoman for her indulgence, and as well the ranking member for his indulgence as well. I would say, Mr. Secretary, many of us have been down this road before, and I must say that, I will say that in engaging the administration, I have received 2 a.m. phone calls. I've received phone calls from the envoy who was in Iraq on these crisis issues. And so I can say that I know that the heart of the administration is in the right place. I also know that there are families who have not been able to be engaged with their loved ones. There are families who have seen their loved ones die in bloodshed that they have not been able to protect. There have been promises made as the camps have been moved from one place to the next, where we have thought that that would have been a safe location, a safe house, and come to find out the most recent attack, bloody attack, that we have experienced has really had our ire be raised. Now, let me just say this. I, along with, I know my colleague, the chairwoman, during the heat of the Iraqi war, we've gone over many times. We've met with Maliki. We were the supporters of Iraq standing on its feet. We were the supporters. She had one position about the war. I had another position about the war. I opposed the war. But we were collectively supportive of Iraq being able to get on its feet, of Iraq being able to have a constitution. I was engaged in the discussions about women being included in the constitution. I take no back seat to trying to give Iraq every measure of opportunity to be the kind of human rights, dignified democracy that they allege that they want to be, to allow everyone to live in dignity. This is not happening. And what I want to focus on, as Mr. Wilson, Mr. Poe, Mr. Rohrabacher, on Camp Ashraf, all of them, to put it in the way of my advocacy for the administration, for Secretary Kerry, and the enormous work that's being done, and my hope for the success of his work. But there are hostages in Iraq that we must have now. There is documentation that those hostages are there by our French allies, by the United Nations, and other supportive group and information. I can't imagine, with the wealth of sophisticated intelligence authorities that we have funded, who have a vast array of information about Americans, cannot pinpoint where starving Iranians, loved ones whose families are trying to save their lives after being on a hunger strike for 73 days. And so I would ask this question of you, already knowing about your heart and your concern. I will not judge you. I already know that you're committed to getting this right. Will you demand of Malachi, not next week, not months from now, but can we expect in the next 48 hours a call to the head of the government of Iraq demanding the release of these hostages and demanding for their release now? Or the documented, undeniable evidence that they are not held within the bounds of Iraq? Second, would you be engaged with, or the Secretary be engaged with, and I have spoken to Secretary Kerry, I know his heart, with Malachi to demand the security of those in Camp Ashraf for now and forever, until an ultimate solution of relocation to their homeland, a place of where their relatives are or where they desire to be. Mr. McGurk, and thank you for your testimony here today, and I thank the gentlelady for yielding. I'm short on this time, but I'm hoping I'll hear from you in a moment.
Congresswoman, thank you, and thank you for your engagement on all of these issues. And I know we've had conversations at particularly difficult times. I want to thank you personally. We can pinpoint where the people are, and I would like to follow up with you on that. They are not in Iraq, the 7 people. They are not in Iraq. And, but I will guarantee that in my conversations with Maliki on down, the safety and security of Camp Ashraf, Camp Liberty, of where the residents are, the Iraqi government needs to do everything possible to keep those people safe, but they will never be safe until they're out of Iraq. And we all need to work together, the MEK, us, the committee, everybody, the international community, to find a place for them to go. There's now a UN trust fund. We've donated $1 million, and we're asking for international contributions to that fund for countries like Albania that don't have the resources, but they're willing to take the MEK in. And we need to press foreign capitals to take them in, because until they're out of Iraq, they're not going to be safe. And we don't want anyone else to get hurt. We don't want any more Americans to get hurt in Iraq. We don't want any more Iraqis to get hurt in Iraq. And we don't want any more residents at Camp Liberty to get hurt in Iraq. And until they're out of Iraq, they're not going to be safe. This is an international crisis, and we need international help and support.
May I just have a moment more to follow up, Mr. McGurk, or Secretary McGurk, and I hear the passion in your voice, but let me just say this. We're in an open hearing. You know where they are. Who is going to rescue them? Whose responsibility will it be to get them from where they are into safe haven? Because otherwise, we're leaving Malachi now without responsibility. We're saying, and you're documenting, that they're not there. Let me just say that when my government speaks, I try with my best heart and mind to believe it. But I've got to see them alive and well to believe that they're not where I think they are, but they're in a pointed purse. I'm glad to hear that. But I want them to be safe, but I want them to be in the arms of their loved ones, or at least able to be recognized by their loved one that they're safe somewhere. So can that be done in the next 48 hours? Can we have a manner that indicates that they are safe?
I will repeat here a statement that we issued on September 16th. And it's notable, and I was going to mention this in my colloquy with Congressman to my left, that within hours of the attack, the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps issued a statement praising the attack. We issued a statement on September 16th calling on the government of Iran to use whatever influence it might have with groups that might be holding these missing persons to secure their immediate release. And I can talk more about details and about the status of these individuals, and I've briefed some members of the subcommittee. I'd be happy to follow up.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ms.
Appreciate that
Jackson-Lee.
briefing. Thank you
Mr.
so very
McGurk,
much.
thank you very much for your testimony. Thank all the witnesses in the audience for your participation. And with that, the subcommittee is adjourned. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.